wind howled through the night, carrying a bitter chill that cut straight to the bone. Garrett Sullivan urged his horse forward through the thick snowdrifts, cursing the weather and the relentless storm. His face was numb from the cold, but his heart was colder still as he thought of the message that had sent him into the night. Fire in the night, come quick. It had been 3 months since he'd last set foot on his family's ranch. Too long. He had been too busy, too consumed with his own empire of land deals, cattle, and the relentless drive to expand into Montana. He had sent letters, money, but never his presence. Not once in all this time had he come back to see his parents, to check on them, to offer them what they truly needed: his time, his support, his love. Now, as he rode through the snow-covered hills, the weight of his neglect pressed down on him. He wasn't sure if he was too late. The fire had been set days ago. Was his family alive? Would they even be there when he arrived? The blizzard swallowed up his tracks, leaving nothing behind but an endless white void. He didn't know what to expect when he reached the site, only that his heart beat erratically with the hope. No, the desperate need that he wasn't too late. As Garrett crested the final hill, the full sight of the ruin hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and his horse slowed to a stop. Where his family's modest cabin had once stood, only blackened timber and a few skeletal remnants remained, reaching up to the gray sky like accusing fingers. A thick blanket of snow had already begun to cover the ashes, nature's way of hiding the evidence of human loss. The barn, miraculously untouched by the flames, stood as the only reminder of, "Mom! Dad!" Garrett's voice cracked in the stillness of the night as he dismounted, boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. His heart pounded painfully in his chest, a mixture of fear and relief, but there was no answer. The wind roared through the desolation, swallowing his voice. He stumbled forward, every step heavier than the last as his eyes searched the wreckage for any sign of life, any trace of his family. But there was nothing. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they didn't make it out? What if they were already gone? Then through the growing darkness and swirling snow, a figure emerged. Old Jennings, the nearest neighbor and one of the few souls who could survive the harsh winters of this isolated valley, stepped forward, a lantern raised high against the storm. "Mr. Sullivan," Jennings called out, his voice gruff with the weight of years lived on this unforgiving land. Garrett's hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his hip. He didn't know whether to greet the man with relief or anger, but Jennings wasn't there to explain the details of the fire. The old homesteader had something more urgent to tell. "Your folks, they're alive, son, but they wouldn't be if it weren't for Sarah Winters." "Sarah Winters?" Garrett asked, confused. He hadn't heard the name in years. An Apache widow living up on Ridge Creek, if he remembered correctly. Her name had never crossed his mind until now. Jennings' lantern light flickered as he nodded, his face grim. "Aye, the fire took hold 3 nights ago, middle of the night. Would have burned them alive if it weren't for Sarah. She was the one who got to them in time. She saved them, pulled them out of the barn and took them in." Garrett's chest tightened with an unfamiliar feeling. Relief, yes, but also a knot of shame. He had been away, building his cattle empire while his parents were in danger, struggling, and this woman, this stranger, had done what he should have done. "Sarah Winters, she's been looking after him ever since," Jennings continued, eyes narrowing as he looked toward the ridge where a faint light flickered in the distance. "She wasn't just passing by when she heard the fire. Your ma told me Sarah's been checking on your folks ever since that city feller, Blackwood, came around making threats about selling their land." Garrett's frown deepened at the mention of Blackwood, a man he had heard about in passing. A banker, the kind that had no business on land like his family's. Jennings continued, his voice low. "Your ma says she overheard a nasty argument between Blackwood and your pa a week before the fire. Said Sarah had been watching him ever since, keeping him safe. She saved him, Garrett. She saved your family." The realization hit Garrett like a wave crashing against rocks. His family had been saved by the very woman he had barely thought of. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with emotion he hadn't known how to express. He turned toward his horse, the cold bite of shame stinging his face as he mounted. "I'm going to her cabin now," he said, his voice firm but betraying the turmoil inside him. Jennings reached out a hand, his old fingers surprisingly strong for his age, gripping Garrett's arm. "Sullivan, your folks needed you 3 days ago. Hell, they needed you 3 months ago." Garrett could only nod, unable to meet the old man's eyes, and he spurred his horse toward the distant glow, each step taking him closer to the woman who had done what he should have done all along. High up on Ridge Creek, where the winds howled through the evergreens and the snow-covered mountains stood as silent witnesses, Sarah Winters had carved out a life from the land. A widow living alone in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness, she had no choice but to rely on her own strength and survival skills. Her husband, Thomas, had passed 2 years earlier from a fever that took him too quickly, and since then, she had made the rugged land her only companion. Sarah was a woman who had known loss and hardship, but also a woman who had learned to stand tall in the face of it. She was Apache, her roots deeply embedded in the soil of this land, and her resilience came from the traditions of her people. Unlike others, she did not run from her pain, but rather accepted it as part of the natural world. She had lost her parents as a young woman, her tribe displaced by the pressures of a growing nation, and now she had lost her husband. But Sarah didn't let grief break. Before the harsh life of widowhood, Sarah had been a nurse in the Union Army, a role forced upon her after the war left so many soldiers in need of care. She had sewn wounds, comforted the dying, and watched men from both sides of the conflict struggle to survive the war and its aftermath. Her hands had healed many, her eyes had seen horrors, but she had survived. And when the war ended, she didn't seek the comforts of city life or the promises of a different future. Instead, she had chosen the quiet, wild. Sarah's small cabin, nestled in a clearing among the pines, stood as a testament to her strength. The walls were built of rough-hewn logs, the roof slanted with years of snow and rain. There was no luxury here, but there was peace, a peace that had been hard-won. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky blushed with the colors of dusk, Sarah would sit outside her cabin, listening to the sounds of the forest around her. Her life, simple as it was, had a rhythm to it. The planting of seeds, the sea. She had learned to respect the land, to understand the balance between giving and taking. Every season brought its challenges, but Sarah was no stranger to them. She had lived through the ravages of war, watched her people suffer at the hands of the white man's greed, and seen her tribes scattered to the winds. Yet through it all, she had held on to the teachings of her ancestors, to stay strong, to care for those in need, and to never give up. Even when the world seemed to fall apart, she had always known. Her love for the land was not just about survival, it was about connection, an unspoken bond that went beyond words. Her Apache roots taught her that nature and people were not separate, they were intertwined. Her ancestors had lived off this land for centuries, and now she was carrying on that legacy. She would not let the world erase that part of her heritage. And so, when Sarah learned of Garrett Sullivan's parents' misfortune, when the smoke from their burning cabin reached her ears, she did not hesitate. She had been keeping watch over them for months, ever since the banker from the town, Blackwood, had come around making threats about selling their land. Sarah had overheard the argument between Garrett's father and Blackwood, and she knew something was not right. The wealthy men in town had no respect for the land or its people. They only cared about profit. Sarah had been checking on the Sullivans ever since, and when the fire came, she was there in time to pull Garrett's parents from the ashes, saving them from certain death. It was no accident that she had arrived just when she did. The land had guided her, as it always had. And in the midst of disaster, it was the Apache woman, the widow who had lost everything, who was the one to give. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't need recognition. She only did what was right. As she led Garrett's parents to her cabin, she did not expect anything in return. The way she saw it, there were enough people in this world who took without giving, who thought money could solve every problem. But Sarah knew that sometimes presence and action mattered more than gold. And when Garrett finally arrived to find his parents alive, but dependent on a stranger's charity, he was forced to confront the choices he had made and the distance he had put between himself and his family. In Sarah, Garrett would find not just a caretaker, but a reflection of what he could have been. She was a woman who had survived, who had learned the true meaning of resilience. And as Garrett's journey of redemption began, it was through Sarah Winters that he would learn what it meant to live with honor, to give without expecting, and to understand that sometimes The greatest strength comes from letting go of pride. The night was cold, colder than Sarah had ever felt before. A gust of wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a scent of smoke that burned her lungs. She had been walking back from the ridge where she often gathered herbs for the coming winter, her thoughts heavy as usual. It was in the midst of that silence when she heard it, a loud crackling noise like thunder, but sharper, more urgent. Her heart skipped a beat. Without a second thought, she turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the horizon for the source of the disturbance. And then, through the trees, she saw it, a thick column of smoke rising into the night sky, black against the starlit heavens. Garrett's ranch. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her hand instinctively went to the small knife at her belt. She didn't need to think. She knew she had to act. Without hesitation, Sarah raced down the hill, her boots sinking into the snow, each step harder than the last as the weight of the night pressed down on her. The Sullivans had been kind to her when she was alone in this wilderness, and though they may not have fully known her struggles, she knew theirs. She couldn't just stand by while the flames consumed everything. By the time Sarah reached the homestead, the flames were already licking the edges of the wooden structure, their hungry tendrils crackling as they tore through the cabin. The barn was still untouched, standing as if it were oblivious to the destruction, consuming everything in its path. She didn't waste time. The snow was deep, the cold biting at her skin, but Sarah wasn't concerned with the storm. She made her way to the barn first, knowing that's where Garrett's parents were most likely to be. As she approached, she heard them calling out, voices strained, desperate. It was Garrett's mother, Clara, her voice filled with terror. She was still alive. "Sarah!" Clara cried out as Sarah reached the barn door. Her voice broke with fear. "We can't get out. The fire, it's too much." Sarah pushed the door open with a force that surprised her. She didn't have much strength left in her, but the urgency of the moment gave her what she needed. Inside, she saw Clara, her face pale, standing beside her husband, Daniel, who looked worse for wear, his back hunched and shaking, but still on his feet. The heat from the fire was already so intense that it made the air heavy, stifling. "Come on," Sarah urged, her voice firm. She moved quickly, grabbing both of them by the arms and pulling them toward the door. She could feel the heat seeping through the walls, the fire pushing at them like an enemy from every side. Daniel tried to move, but his old body struggled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Sarah, you don't have to do this," Clara said, panic in her voice. "You'll get caught in the fire." "I'm not leaving you behind," Sarah replied, gritting her teeth against the cold. She pulled Daniel toward the door, lifting him with what little strength she had left. His legs barely held him, but Sarah wasn't going to stop. She would not let them die tonight, not on her watch. With one final push, she got them outside just as the roof of the cabin began to cave in. The flames roared above them, but they were out. She had gotten them out. Sarah half carried, half dragged them toward the woods, her feet heavy in the deep snow. The storm was still howling around them, but Sarah felt a rush of relief. They were alive. They made it to the ridge where Sarah's small cabin stood, a modest but safe haven. As she helped them inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed them, though the relief was short-lived. Sarah knew the night was far from over. It wasn't until later that she found herself sitting in front of the fire, Clara resting in the chair beside her, Daniel lying down in the small bed she had set up for them. The exhaustion of the night had caught up with Sarah, but she couldn't rest yet. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, the way the fire had nearly taken them all, how close they had come to being lost in that inferno. She wondered where Garrett was. He had no idea yet, and Sarah hadn't thought to look for him. In the cold silence of the cabin, the weight of what she had done settled on her. Garrett Sullivan finally returned to the place he had once called home, but nothing was as he had imagined. The storm that had driven him to this point still whipped through the landscape, but now it seemed to echo the turmoil in his chest. His horse's hooves crunched over the snow as he approached the cabin, the dim glow of a fire flickering in the window. The familiar sight of the homestead, now blackened and cold, felt alien to him. As he dismounted and stepped into the small cabin, the silence hit him first, heavy and oppressive. His father, Daniel, sat in his chair by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. There was no greeting, no warm embrace, just the same stern expression Garrett had grown up with, one that had never softened, not even when Garrett was a child. He had thought that returning home would fix things, that he would be welcomed back as the prodigal son. But the silence in the room and the way his father refused to acknowledge his presence made Garrett feel more like an intruder. Garrett felt his stomach churn, the weight of his father's disapproval pressing down on him. "Father," he began, his voice thick with regret. "I'm sorry, I should have been here sooner." Daniel didn't respond. He simply stared into the fire, his jaw set tight. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Garrett wanted to reach out, to say more, but something in his father's coldness stopped him. On the other side of the room, Clara, his mother, looked up at him. Her eyes softened, but her smile was faint, distant. She had always been the gentle one, the one who had tried to keep peace between father and son. But even she couldn't hide the way she looked at him now, as if he were a stranger, a man she didn't fully recognize. "Garrett, you're here," she said quietly. The words almost a sigh of relief, though the warmth in her voice didn't reach her eyes. "Thank God. But where were you? We needed you." Garrett stood frozen, the weight of his mother's words cutting deeper than any physical wound. His mother's love had always been unconditional, but now it felt distant, like a memory fading away. The emptiness of the room, the gap between the two people who had once been everything to him, crushed him. He had neglected them for so long, too absorbed in his work, in his ambition. Now the consequences of his choices lay heavy in the silence that filled the cabin. Garrett turned and stepped back outside, needing air, needing space to think. The cold wind slapped against his face as he walked toward the barn. He hadn't planned to be gone this long. He hadn't meant to ignore his family, but the lure of land deals and cattle had consumed him. He had justified it all as part of providing for his parents, building something lasting, something that would secure their future. But now standing here, he realized that he had given up the one thing that mattered most, time with them. And then he saw her, Sarah Winters. She was standing near the edge of the ridge, looking down toward the cabin. Her presence was as solid and unwavering as the land itself, but it was her eyes that caught him off guard. They were sharp, fierce, eyes that had seen more than their fair share of suffering, yet still held a glimmer of something deeper. Strength, maybe, or perhaps it was simply survival. When Sarah turned and saw him, her face remained impassive, but Garrett could feel the weight of her gaze. She was not the helpless woman he had imagined. She was a force, a woman who had faced her own battles and had come through stronger for it. Garrett, in his arrogance, had never really thought much of her, just a widow, an outsider, but now standing before her, he realized how wrong he had been. "Sarah," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "You made it back, Mr. Sullivan. That's good." Her tone was neutral, almost distant, and it stung more than Garrett expected. It was clear that she wasn't looking for thanks. She had done what needed to be done. And now, with her, there was no room for pretense, no space for Garrett's usual charm or quick words. She had already seen too much of the world to be impressed by him. To her, he was just another man who had learned his lesson too late. Garrett shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her presence making him feel smaller, more vulnerable. "I never thanked you for what you did, for saving my parents." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied, her voice steady but not unkind. "I did what was right." Her simplicity, her directness struck him. She hadn't hesitated when it mattered most. And now, standing before her, Garrett understood that he had spent so much of his life focusing on the wrong things. His family had always needed him, but he had been too busy chasing wealth to see it. He felt the guilt flood him, a slow burn in his chest. Sarah's gaze softened just a fraction, and for the first time since his return, Garrett felt a shift, a small crack in the armor he had built around himself. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time the words carrying more weight than they ever had before. Sarah didn't respond right away. She simply nodded, as if accepting his apology without needing more. Garrett, for the first time in a long while, felt the weight of his own actions, and the road ahead would be long, but it had to start somewhere. And this moment, standing in the cold with Sarah Winters, might just be the beginning of his awakening. The wind howled through the trees, relentless and cold, as Garrett stood in front of the barn, his thoughts clouded by a storm of his own. The fire had been put out, the ashes of his past scattered in the snow, and yet he couldn't shake the weight of what had transpired. It was as if the fire hadn't just burned the cabin, but had scorched the very fabric of his life. He couldn't stop thinking about the events that had brought him to this point, the guilt, the neglect, the wreckage of his own choices. But it wasn't just about him. It was about Blackwood. Garrett had heard the name in passing before. The banker from town, the one who had been pressuring his parents to sell their land. Garrett had never truly listened, had brushed off the rumors, thinking it was just business as usual. But now, standing at the edge of the ruins, the truth hit him like a slap across the face. Blackwood had more than just business dealings in mind. He had been scheming, trying to seize control of the land his family had worked for generations. Garrett's parents hadn't just been fighting for their home. They had been fighting for their very survival against a man who saw their land as nothing more than a prize to be claimed. Garrett felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had failed them. He had allowed someone like Blackwood to slither into their lives while he was away chasing wealth. He had let his own greed and ambition cloud his judgment. Now, with everything at stake, Garrett knew what he had to do. He had to face the man who had caused this chaos. He had to confront Blackwood. As the days passed, Garrett and Sarah worked side by side, rebuilding the broken pieces of the Sullivan homestead. Sarah never asked for anything in return. She had done what she did out of kindness, out of a sense of duty to the land and its people. But Garrett knew that her presence here, helping his family, had done more for him than any amount of money or land ever could. The more time they spent together, the more Garrett realized how much he had overlooked. His life had been consumed by the pursuit of wealth, by the idea that success meant owning more, achieving more. But what had that really brought him? A fractured relationship with his parents, a hollow existence. And now, thanks to Sarah, he was beginning to see that true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in the strength of the bonds you shared with others. One cold morning, after the barn had been repaired and the firewood stacked high, Garrett stood at the edge of the property, looking out over the land. He could see the distant outline of the town where Blackwood lived, and he knew that he couldn't wait any longer. The time had come for him to make things right. "Sarah," Garrett said, his voice rough with determination, "I need to go into town. There's someone I need to see." Sarah looked up from the pile of wood she was stacking, her expression unreadable. "Blackwood?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Garrett nodded. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't get away with what he's done. It's time I took responsibility for everything. For my family, for this land, for the mistakes I've made." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded and returned to her task, but Garrett could feel her watchful gaze on him. She knew what was at stake. She knew the kind of man Blackwood was, and she knew that Garrett's confrontation with him wasn't going to be easy. As Garrett made his way into town later that day, the weight of his decision pressed down on him with every step. He wasn't just going to confront Blackwood for the land. He was confronting the man who had taken so much from him without even realizing it. Blackwood had been the catalyst for Garrett's realization, the one who had pushed him to finally see the truth. The town was quieter than usual as Garrett walked down the main street, the shadow of Blackwood's bank looming over him. Garrett had been here countless times before, but this time it felt different. There was a sense of finality in the air, a tension that Garrett couldn't ignore. He entered the bank with purpose, the bell above the door ringing with a sharp jingle. Blackwood looked up from behind his desk, his usual smug expression slipping for a moment when he saw Garrett standing in the doorway. "Garrett Sullivan," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What brings you here? I thought you had better things to do than waste your time on this old land." Garrett took a step forward, his voice calm but laced with anger. "I'm here to make sure you never hurt my family again, Blackwood. I'm here to make you answer for the pain you've caused." The two men stood there locked in a silent standoff, and for the first time, Garrett felt the weight of his family's legacy on his shoulders. This was his fight now, his choice to step up and protect what mattered most. The wind had died down by the time Garrett returned to the homestead, but the tension that hung in the air was thicker than the cold that still gripped the land. His heart beat heavily in his chest as he approached the cabin, but this time, he was not headed for the warmth of the fire or the comforting presence of his mother. He was headed toward the figure who had loomed over him all his life, his father, Daniel Sullivan. Garrett had avoided this moment for years, hiding behind his work, his ambition, his successes. He had kept his distance, convincing himself that his father's anger was something he couldn't change. But now, standing at the edge of the land that had been passed down for generations, Garrett knew there could be no more running. He entered the cabin, his boots crunching on the floorboards, and found Daniel sitting by the fire once more. The flames cast long shadows on his father's weathered face, but Garrett saw no warmth in his eyes, the same coldness that had been there when Garrett had left to fight for the Union Army, the same anger that had driven a wedge between them. "Father," Garrett began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years left unspoken. "We need to talk." Daniel didn't look up from the fire. His weathered hands, calloused from years of hard work, gripped his chair as if it were the only thing that could anchor him to this world. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Garrett felt the years of distance between them, the gulf that had grown since that fateful day when he had left to fight in the war. "I don't know what you want from me, Garrett," Daniel said, his voice rough like gravel. "You made your choice all those years ago. You left. You fought for a cause that wasn't ours. You took up arms against our people, against everything I stood for." Garrett's heart sank. The bitterness in his father's words was like a blade cutting through the air. It was the same anger that had been there when Garrett had enlisted, the same anger that had driven a wedge between them. "I didn't have a choice, Father. You didn't understand. I thought I was doing what was right," Garrett said, his voice rising with frustration. "You thought you were doing what was right," Daniel repeated, his voice low and heavy with years of hurt. "You thought you were doing what was right, but you left your family. You left us to fight our battles alone. You turned your back on us, Garrett, and now you come back after all this time expecting forgiveness, expecting me to forget." Garrett stood still, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. The truth of what Daniel said hit him like a fist to the chest. He had been so consumed with his own sense of duty, with his own desires for glory, that he had abandoned the very people who had shaped him. He had thought the war was his fight, but he had forgotten that the fight for his family's future, for their survival, was far more important than any war he had ever fought. "I'm sorry," Garrett whispered, his voice cracking. "I never should have left. I never should have abandoned you. Or Mom." Daniel finally turned to face him, his eyes cold, but filled with a sadness that Garrett hadn't expected. The years of anger, of betrayal, were written all over his father's face. But behind that anger, Garrett could see something else, a pain that ran deeper than any of the words they had exchanged. "You think it was easy for me?" Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You think I didn't feel it every day when I looked at your mother and saw the pain in her eyes? When I worked this land alone, every damn day, knowing you were out there, fighting for someone else's cause, and we were left to scrape by?" Garrett swallowed hard, the guilt rising in his chest like a heavy stone. He had never truly understood the depth of his father's pain. He had always seen Daniel as a man of strength, a man who could take anything life threw at him, but he hadn't realized the toll it had taken on him to carry the burden alone. "I didn't understand," Garrett admitted, his voice soft. "I didn't understand how much it hurt you, how much it hurt Mom." Daniel's expression softened just a fraction, but the anger still lingered. "You'll never understand what it was like, Garrett, but I'll tell you this. You've got a chance to make it right. You've got a chance to fix what you've broken." Garrett nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. This was more than just about repairing a relationship with his father. It was about facing the choices he had made and taking responsibility for them. It was about rebuilding not just the land, but the trust that had been broken between them. "I'm here now," Garrett said, his voice steady, "and I'm not leaving until I make it right. For you, for Mom, for this land." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he nodded, though it was clear the wounds of the past would not heal overnight. "We'll see," he said gruffly. "We'll see if you can fix this mess you've made." As Garrett stood there facing his father, he knew that the path to redemption would be long and difficult. But for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past decisions beginning to lift. He had a chance to make things right, to rebuild what he had broken. And it started with this moment, standing before his father, acknowledging the pain he had caused, and taking the first step toward healing. The days after the fire seemed endless. But slowly, Garrett, along with his parents and Sarah, began the long and painstaking process of rebuilding. The land had taken so much from them already, time, sweat, and tears, but it was still there, still strong, and still full of promise. The house, once a place of warmth and laughter, now stood as a shell of its former self. But that was going to change. Garrett could feel it deep in his bones. They started with the foundation, laying new beams and hammering together what was left of the structure. Every nail, every beam was a step toward healing, not just for the house, but for their lives. They worked long days, waking before dawn and working into the evening, their hands calloused and raw. Sarah, though she had her own cabin, was there every step of the way. She didn't ask for anything in return. She just worked. She didn't need thanks, and Garrett learned early on that Sarah's form of help came not from words but from action. Garrett spent most of his time beside his father, Daniel, as they rebuilt the barn and the rooms of the house. But it was in the quiet moments when the day's work was done and the fire burned low in the hearth that Garrett felt the real weight of what they were doing. This wasn't just about constructing walls and roofs. It was about repairing the foundation of a family, something that had cracked and crumbled over the years. There was a weight to that kind of work, and it was something Garrett had never realized before. At night after dinner, Garrett would sometimes step outside to catch his breath, the cool night air clearing the fog in his mind. He'd look up at the stars, knowing they were a constant, something his family had always depended on. He had seen his life through a lens of ambition for so long, but now in the stillness of the night, he saw things differently. He could see the land for what it truly was, not just a commodity to be sold or a means of gaining wealth, but a place that held his family's legacy. Sarah, too, was changing. She had never been one to open up, her past too full of pain for her to let anyone in. But in the quiet hours when the firelight danced on the walls of the cabin, she and Garrett would exchange quiet words, sometimes about the work they were doing, and sometimes about things that were harder to put into words. In the beginning, the silence between them was thick, filled with the awkwardness of two people who had always kept their distance. But slowly, Sarah's guarded nature began to soften, and Garrett's own walls began to crack. She was a woman who had known loss in ways Garrett couldn't even begin to understand. She had lost her husband, her tribe, her place in the world, and yet she stood strong. Garrett found himself admiring her more with every passing day. She was nothing like the women he had known in the past, those who had been polished, kept in their proper places by society. Sarah was raw, real, and unafraid to speak her mind. And in that, Garrett found something he hadn't realized he needed: honesty. He had lived his life for so long pretending to be someone he wasn't, but Sarah had no need for pretense. And in the evenings, as the wind howled outside, Garrett and Sarah would sit together by the fire, their silence comfortable, their presence enough. They didn't need to speak all the time. There was something about the stillness between them, something that felt right. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a deep respect, an understanding of the burdens they both carried. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly began to take shape. It wasn't as grand as Garrett had once dreamed it would be, but it was sturdy and warm. It was theirs. The room for his father, the small space for Daniel to recover from his old injuries, was the first to be completed. And when Daniel walked through the door of his new room for the first time, Garrett saw something shift in his father's expression. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acceptance, and for Garrett, that was enough. In the days that followed, the small moments of tenderness, like when Sarah placed a hand on Garrett's shoulder, her silent support, and the shared understanding between him and his father, made him realize that this, more than anything, was what he had been searching for. It wasn't fame or riches or even land. It was the bond of family, the strength of those who stood by you in the darkest of times, who helped you rebuild when everything else had burned away. Garrett was standing again, not just physically but emotionally. The days of rebuilding had brought some semblance of peace to Garrett's life, but the calm was always fragile, like the thin shell of ice that covered the creek in the early mornings. The cold wind would blow in from the mountains, sweeping across the valley, reminding him that the battle was far from over. Even as Garrett worked to help his father recover, the weight of the past, the danger Blackwood posed, hung over him like a storm cloud that refused to clear. Daniel's health was improving slowly. The new room Garrett had built for him was more than just a place to rest. It was a sign that things were changing, but there was no mistaking it. Daniel was still weakened by years of hard work and the emotional toll of the past. Garrett had seen the strain in his father's eyes, the weariness that could never be fully shaken off. But the small moments of laughter, of peace, were enough to keep him going. Yet despite their efforts to rebuild, Garrett could not escape the shadow of Blackwood. The banker's hold on the land was a relentless thing, a weight that would not lift. He had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to claim the land that Garrett's family had worked for generations. He had sent threats before, thinly veiled warnings disguised as business deals, but Garrett knew the man wasn't done yet. Blackwood was like the fire that had burned down their home, destructive, consuming, and relentless. One night, as Garrett sat by the fire in Sarah's cabin, his mind wandered to the thoughts of what lay ahead. The firewood crackled in the hearth, but it did little to ease the unease gnawing at his chest. There had been no sign of Blackwood in recent weeks, no overt threats, but Garrett knew better than to think the man had given up. There was always something lurking, waiting to strike. Sarah sat across from him, the glow of the fire lighting her face, but her eyes were sharp, always observing. "You're thinking about Blackwood, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Garrett looked up at her, startled by how easily she could read him. "I have to be," he said, leaning back against the chair, the weight of his words sinking in. "I can't shake the feeling that something's coming. I don't know what, but I feel it in my gut. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Sarah didn't answer right away. She only nodded, her gaze far away, as if contemplating something she hadn't shared with him yet. After a moment, she spoke again. "When the storm comes, you'll have to stand ready, not just for yourself, but for your family, and for this land." Garrett swallowed, the weight of her words pressing on him like the mountain wind outside. "I know. I just don't know how much more I can protect them. What if I can't stop him?" Sarah's voice was firm, unyielding. "Then you'll fight for what matters. And if it costs you everything, then you fight harder. Because in the end, Garrett, it's not the land that matters. It's the people you protect. It's what you're willing to fight for." The next day the storm arrived. Not a storm of snow or rain, but a storm of violence. A force of nature far more destructive. Garrett and Sarah were inside the cabin when they first heard the sounds. The galloping hooves of horses, the shouting voices of men. Blackwood's men had come. It wasn't just a raid for the land, it was a final assault, a desperate attempt to drive Garrett and his family from their home. Garrett grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, Sarah at his side. His father was still too weak to fight, but Garrett wouldn't leave him behind. Not this time. "Get to the barn, Dad," Garrett ordered, his voice a low growl of determination. "Sarah, help him." But Sarah didn't need to be told. She moved with the fluidity of someone who had seen violence up close, someone who knew what it meant to survive. She helped Daniel inside the barn, where it was safer, then grabbed her own rifle, ready to stand with Garrett against whatever Blackwood had thrown at them. The first wave came like a storm itself. Riders on horseback charging toward the cabin, guns drawn. Garrett fired first, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing through the air. One of Blackwood's men went down, but there were more coming. Garrett had no time to think, only to act. Through the haze of gunfire and smoke, Garrett realized something. He wasn't just fighting for the land anymore. He was fighting for his family, for Sarah, for everything that had ever mattered to him. And in that moment, when the storm seemed like it would swallow them whole, Garrett stood firm. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was his stand. The days after the attack felt like a blur, as if time itself had slowed down. Garrett, standing at the precipice of his past and future, knew he could no longer avoid the reckoning. Blackwood's men had come with fire and fury, but Garrett had stood his ground. They had won that battle, but the war was far from over. The land, the family, and the community were still at risk, and Garrett knew that the fight for justice wouldn't be won with bullets alone. As Garrett stood in the quiet of his cabin, staring out across the land his family had fought so hard to keep, he realized that the next step would be one of law. There had been too many underhanded deals, too many threats, and too many years of Blackwood's manipulation for him to let it go. This fight was about something more than just land. It was about standing up for what was right, for those who could not defend themselves. "I'm going to take him to court," Garrett said to Sarah, who sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap as she listened intently. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but questioning. "This man won't go down easily. He's not someone who plays by the rules." "I know," Garrett replied, his voice firm. "But if we don't stand up for this land, for my family, who will? We've fought with our hands for too long. Now it's time to use the law." Sarah didn't argue. She knew as well as he did that Blackwood wouldn't give up easily. The man had spent years making sure his grip on the town and the land was ironclad. He was powerful, wealthy, and used to getting his way. But Garrett wasn't afraid anymore. He had seen what it felt like to protect what mattered most, and he wasn't going to back down. The next weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, documents, and negotiations. Garrett, with the help of Sarah, who had her own understanding of the law, went to work. They enlisted the help of a lawyer in town who wasn't afraid of Blackwood's influence, someone who understood the importance of justice more than money. As the court date approached, Garrett felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had faced down enemies with guns, but this was different. This was a battle for the truth, for what was right. And deep inside, Garrett felt something else shift, something he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years feeling like he had to prove himself, like he had to live up to some ideal of what it meant to be a Sullivan. But now, as he stood beside his family and Sarah, he realized that the only thing he knew. The courtroom was packed when the day finally came. Blackwood sat at the front, his smug expression never wavering. Garrett could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of everything on the line. The trial was long, full of legal wrangling and arguments that seemed to stretch on forever. But Garrett didn't falter. He told the truth, the whole truth, and that truth rang louder than any lies Blackwood could spin. In the end, justice prevailed. The court ruled in Garrett's favor, ordering Blackwood to cease his claims on the land and pay reparations for the damage he had caused. The relief that washed over Garrett was overwhelming. He had won, not just for himself, but for his family, for the community, and for the legacy that had been passed down for generations. But even as the gavel came down, Garrett knew that the real victory wasn't just in the court's decision. It was in the way his father had looked at him that day, pride finally shining in his eyes. It was in the way Sarah had stood beside him, unwavering through everything. As Garrett walked out of the courthouse, a sense of peace settled over him. He had made things right, but more importantly, he had made peace with himself. He had been given a second chance, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. As the days turned into weeks and the seasons began to shift from winter to the soft warmth of spring, Garrett found himself standing at a crossroads in his life. The land that had once consumed him, the empire he had built with his own hands, now felt like a distant memory, a chapter in his past that had served its purpose but no longer defined him. He had fought for his family, for justice, and for redemption. But the fight had also taught him something far more valuable, that true wealth was not measured in gold, but in the people you loved and the bonds you built with them. And it was with Sarah that Garrett felt this truth more than ever. The woman who had once seemed like an outsider, a widow with a troubled past, had become the one person who truly understood him. Their bond had begun not in the desperate moments of survival, but in the quiet, unspoken understanding that grew between them as they worked side by side to rebuild their lives. They had shared the labor, the sweat, the small victories of their days, but it was in the stillness of the night, by the flickering firelight, that they had begun to share something far deeper. In the early days, Garrett had seen Sarah as a necessity, someone to help him, someone who had saved his parents. But now he saw her for who she truly was, a woman of strength, resilience, and wisdom. Her Apache roots ran deep, and Garrett had come to respect not just her knowledge of the land, but the way she carried herself through life with an unwavering, quiet dignity. She wasn't just a survivor of loss. She was a woman who had found peace within herself, and that peace had drawn Garrett in. Their relationship had never been about grand gestures or passionate confessions. It had grown slowly, like the land around them, each moment adding to the foundation they were building together. It was in the small things, when Garrett would catch her eye across the room, or when she would lay a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. It was in the way they had learned to communicate without words, understanding each other's thoughts, fears, and hopes with just a glance. There was no rush, no pressure, only the slow, steady unfolding of something that felt right. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the stars began to peek out from the darkening sky, Garrett stood beside Sarah on the ridge, looking out over the land they had fought so hard to protect. The fields stretched before them, rich with the promise of a new season, and for the first time in a long while, Garrett felt a deep sense of contentment settle in his chest. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led him to this moment. He turned to Sarah, her profile outlined against the fading light, and felt a swell of emotion he hadn't expected. This wasn't just gratitude, it was something more, something deeper. "I don't know what the future holds," Garrett said quietly, his voice steady but filled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. "But I know I want to face it with you." Sarah didn't immediately respond. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if considering his words. After a long moment, she turned to him, and for the first time, Garrett saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. It wasn't just understanding, it was a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that they were both ready to step forward together. "I never thought I'd find peace here," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of loss and struggle. "But I think I have, Garrett, and I think I found something more." There was no need for more words. They stood together in silence, the weight of everything they had gone through resting between them, and for the first time, Garrett felt as though he was truly home. Not in the house they had rebuilt, not on the land, but in the quiet, unspoken connection that had grown between them. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to a rhythm, but it was a different rhythm now. Garrett was no longer the man who lived for the land or the business deals. He was a man who lived for the moments that mattered, the quiet mornings with his family, the laughter that filled the cabin, the quiet strength of a woman who had become his anchor. Garrett had learned that sometimes the greatest battles weren't the ones fought with weapons, but the ones fought within oneself. He had learned to forgive, to let go of the guilt that had burdened him for so long, and to embrace the future with open arms. And as he looked toward that future, standing beside Sarah, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together.